Hello.
Welcome. How are you guys?
Thank you.
Hey, Ash.
Hey,
How's it going?
good, thank you. How
You
are you?
know, it's good.
Pushing through. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about brand strategies. We're going to talk about tone deafness, talk about what's the right timing to adapt your branding strategy. And maybe to start with that, we've seen many brands kind of panicking a little bit in response to COVID-19, being very passive, not doing anything at the moment, trying to sort of wait out the storm a little bit. Alain, you argue that that actually isn't the right approach. Can you explain a little bit why that is?
Well, I think there's so many reasons to not wait in general. I think a lot of companies and brands are waiting to see, how are consumers going to behave? How are they going to interact with brands? How are they going to interact with products? And in moments of crises, our instinct is always to flee. It's a survival instinct. It's your fight or flight, right? And I think that's what the equivalent here is, where brands are just paralyzed, waiting. When in reality, the new normal, the quote unquote new normal, hasn't actually been created yet. And the burden is on brands to create that new normal. And there's a different instinct to tap into there that's more about progress than more about survival. So I think this is the time where brands can actually have permission to be a little bit more deliberate and intentional in creating things for users.
Okay. And Ash, WhatsApp actually hasn't been passive at all. You guys have done many things in response to the coronavirus crisis. I think many very tangible, useful things, such as, for example, creating new tools to avoid spreading of fake news, or at least try to avoid that where possible. But also been working on remote calling. I think we used to be able to do it with 4 people. Now you can do it with 8 people. So really try to improve connection remotely between people. How have your users responded to doing this?
I think a first principle for always in these situations is think about what your users need and where their tensions are, and deliver against them, and you should get a good response. I think the one thing we tried to do as sort of the pandemic took hold was really understand how behavior on our platform was changing, right? And what we realized was that obviously we're predominantly a messaging platform, that video calling was becoming more of a need as remote connection was becoming more of a need as people were in isolation. So the first thing we did was change remote video calling from 4 people to 6 people, just to enhance their ability to gather more people together in a remote fashion. And as you said, the other thing we realized was that there was a need for useful information and the right information and the most accurate information at a time when people weren't sure what to believe. One thing we've done is partner with the World Health Organization and various organizations like that in different countries to actually create WhatsApp bots where people can actually interact with these organizations to get the right information. So it's been born from a consumer need, so the response has been quite positive.
And were there any campaigns that you've paused or that you've changed because of this?
Yeah. So I think the one thing brands can tend to do in these situations is maybe overthink what they need to do. And I think the principles of marketing are always the same. And that's really understanding your users, where there's attention, where there's a need, and how does your product or brand provide value. And so we were embarking on a brand campaign. We didn't change that direction. What we did alter was the use cases around it. Obviously, the use cases have changed significantly when people are at home. So we launched something recently in Brazil that was about a mom and daughter who were separated and isolated this time, but how they managed to use WhatsApp to stay in contact with each other. Now, 3 months ago, that would not have been a relevant use case. It's very much a relevant use case now. So we haven't pivoted our strategy and what we think is right and our value to users. We're looking at the relevant use cases and how the culture is reflecting that right now.
And question for Alain, have you seen other examples of brands that were able to provide actual support?
Right. So we've been paying close attention, trying to track the best practices at a time like this, because this is so new. But before I give you examples, I would love to build on what Ash just said about needs, because needs have always been important in how brands have relied on to communicate messaging and develop initiatives. But it's interesting to think of how these needs have evolved with COVID-19. There are new needs emerging or being prioritized, needs like information, or needs like the sense of collectivity or connectivity, or the sense of comfort. And so connectivity is a new need, and there are great brands that have tapped into this. WhatsApp is prioritized connectivity, and it's new significance in people's lives. There are other great examples in the telecommunication space. Where in T-Mobile, for example, globally has made their telecommunication services, their cell phone services, data and so on, much more accessible to everybody. They've lowered the pricing, and they've created different tiers, things that they never did prior to COVID-19. And that really is a great example of tapping into your equity, providing something that delivers on new needs or new prioritized needs at a time like now.
Definitely. Yeah, so we've seen a few interesting examples, I think. We've seen companies pivot to basically doing whole new things, right? I think Decathlon actually was able to create masks out of their scuba diving masks, or ventilating masks, actually. So we've seen some very sort of innovative things there. But I think one of the things that's important here is that brands actually should really focus maybe a little bit away from selling their product and, providing support. So I was looking for maybe some interesting examples there where a company did something very specific for their users, gave something away for free that you thought was a good example of dealing with the crisis at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a philosophical debate here a little bit, Anouk, where, there are two things companies can do at a time like this. They can provide relief and service and sort of in a philanthropic way. LVMH created hand sanitizer, for example. Chanel created masks. Those are very, in the Decathlon and the suits, those are very kind of responsive to the moment. But then there's something else that you can do at this time, which taps more into your equity and your purpose as a company. Lush Cosmetics is a great example. Their whole platform is around making beauty accessible. And they've opened their doors to allow customers to go in and wash their hands. And so that provides relief, but it also taps into the purpose that pre-existed the virus. Whereas creating hand sanitizer as a luxury goods company it's definitely needed and it's awesome and they should be applauded for that. But does it align with the core brand purpose is a question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what was interesting when we spoke before is when you mentioned that brands tend to have a sort of archetype that they already fit into. So for example, one brand can be a bit more of the hero, whereas other can be more of the nurse or whatever. And I think what's important, or what you mentioned before, is that they at least should stick with that archetype and not try to become something else in response to the crisis. Can you maybe explain a little bit more how that works?
Sure. Yeah, brand archetypes is a brand strategy fundamental thing. There are 12 or so different archetypes: the hero, the magician, the jester. What brand archetype do you stand for? And a lot of brands are actually using this time to shift away from the archetype they've been. So Disney has always been the magician, this idea that takes you away. But maybe in response to COVID-19, they're taking a new approach. Now, to the point, Anouk, is that your purpose is timeless and your archetype should be timeless, and you shouldn't shift just to be more timely. Your purpose shouldn't shift just to be more timely. Brands are timeless, built on timeless needs. So the question is, how do you stay true to who you were at a time as things change?
So how to know what the right timing is and what the right kind of tone of voice is that you can use? Maybe a question for Ash. Is there a rule book that brands can follow?
I think that maybe a misstep a lot of brands are making is that they need to change the way marketing is done in this moment. I think the principles of marketing are very much still the same. Obviously, the season and the culture has changed a lot, and the consumer landscape has changed a lot at this point. But I think the brands that are doing this well have stayed, like to Alain's point, have stayed true to themselves. I'll give you a brand that might be out there, but I think that the brands that have just thought about the moment, what do their users need, and how do we meet that moment, have done really well. I'll give you a great example. Might be a little out there in the sense of The Last Dance by ESPN, which has probably become the weird, unintentionally, a big cultural moment this year. That was scheduled to air in, I think, July after the NBA season. The NBA season got paused in March. They brought it forward because there was a huge, people were sitting at home and there was no live sport to watch, and they saw an opportunity to bring the show forward. And suddenly Sunday night TV became a thing where people were gathered around the television again in the streaming era, watching a television show and waiting for it to air. And it became a huge cultural phenomenon. And I'd argue that is great brand work by ESPN, that they have thought about the moment, thought about how what they're true to, which is sport, and how do they meet that moment. And I think argue probably some of the best marketing work I've seen so far in this moment.
And how can you avoid to come across as insensitive or to try to basically profit from other people's struggles?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think there's some. It's a good question. I think one, just do the right thing. Like I think most brands out there, I think I've done two things. There's like three, I think, stages of where brands are right now. One, brands that have always been useful and they're just more useful in this moment. Some great examples like Lysol, Dettol, Purell, who understand that there's more relevance to their product and they made themselves more available from a supply chain and brand perspective. There's brands that are suddenly way more useful in this moment that people never considered before. And I think they're the ones that are a bit more at danger of sort of potentially capitalizing too much on the situation. And I think ultimately I think if you put the user first and have genuine brand values, as Alain has talked about, you should avoid trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Alain, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, Ash said something really smart.
Okay,
well, first
great.
of all, I love The Last Dance, and he and I are huge basketball fans, so that's a great example. But all the great examples that he mentioned oftentimes fall beyond the technology industry. Isn't that interesting? That maybe there's something inherent about technology brands where the question of tone deafness is a little bit more relevant. I would argue that technology brands were tone deaf before the crisis, and that maybe this has only made it a little bit more vivid. And what I mean by that is sometimes these brands take a very kind of righteous or self-righteous tone, which feels out of character because, after all, these companies were largely created by engineers. And I would argue oftentimes these tech companies lack a certain emotional and social sensitivity. So all of a sudden, for these tech companies to be thrust into these very emotional moments, obviously they're going to be a little tone deaf. Now, you asked the question, how do brands avoid that? How do tech brands and all brands truly avoid that? To me, it's about being relevant. It's about being useful. It's about being transparent, reliable, humble. Those are kind of new ideas for tech brands, perhaps. But I think that is sort of the code. Be truly relevant, be truly useful, be truly transparent, reliable, humble. Those to me are the important implications for that new way of communicating.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so you say for tech companies, it might be actually already at the root of the company that they might not be fully in line, or at least do not have the same values, and that's sort of showing now, or that's coming out now. But okay, to maybe name a few examples, gossiping hour, which tech companies didn't get it right?
Well, so SYLVAIN Labs is a strategy and design consultancy that I run. So, and a lot of our clients are big tech companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter. But but we've developed an approach for brands to communicate at this time for those tech companies to do better. I will give you one example that's not a client, and that's Amazon. Now, Amazon is, and I love Amazon. This is probably the only time you'll ever hear me say something negative about Amazon. Amazon is truly unparalleled when it comes to solving customer needs and really understanding customers and delivering services in ways that we haven't seen across the board, beyond e-commerce. But their response to COVID-19, while functionally amazing, has been on a more emotional level very much a letdown. We don't know Amazon's voice. We see they're donating money. We see that they're rewarding employees. Perhaps they're not getting credit for that in the right way. But what is Amazon's emotional positioning here? And how do they understand us? And I would argue that silence is also a type of tone deafness. And Amazon, I think, has been silent and really, as a result, been tone deaf.
And what should they have done if they were a brand that you had in your portfolio? What would you have advised them to do?
We'd advise them to have a message. I have bought thousands of things from Amazon in the past few months, as a lot of us in the US have. But I don't really know Amazon's point of view right now. I don't really know what they're, and so I would invest in that message so that I understand them as a peer in this world. They're a contemporary entity in this world. Right now, they're an abstract company that's providing me goods, and that's it. And again, they're functionally driven. So maybe that's the reason they're there. But if they were more emotional, it would be another thing. So my recommendation would be to tap into more of an emotional instinct. Right.
Okay. And if we're going to talk about the new normal, or at least brand strategies under the new normal, are we ready to start thinking about that and for a long-term branding strategy, or do we now just need to do something in between, basically just react to what's going on right now and forget about the long-term strategy for a little bit? Ash?
I think it depends on where your brand sits in this spectrum. For example, if you are a brand that existed before this pandemic, I don't think your strategy changes. Maybe the channels and your execution strategy and your creative strategy changes, but I can't imagine suddenly the values and the purpose of your brand should change significantly, unless you're in a sector where the pandemic has significantly changed your business, i.e. the travel sector obviously has been hit relatively hard by this, and that may require complete rethinking of the business and hence your brand. But if that's not happening, I don't think your brand should change. It's really, how do you think about the unique value of your product in this period of time, or however long it is, and how do you bring that to life? But then there's like brands that have suddenly become way more relevant in this period, and I think there's a number of video calling products and home gyms, weirdly, that have become suddenly very relevant in this moment. That's probably an opportunity for brands like that to think about what do they stand for and what their purpose is. But I think it's Alan's point on
Oh,
all right.
Are
We
you-
seem to have some technical difficulties.
yeah. Something happened.
Technical difficulties.
Hi, Anouk. I think we
Hey.
lost sound to your speaker.
Oh no.
Okay, both of them.
I'm here. I don't know if you hear me.
Oh yeah, I can. Oh yeah, there they are. Sorry, guys. Ash was cut off for
Ash,
just a
your
moment.
ideas were so big, they kind of blew up the internet.
Both of you are back now.
I think Ash is still cut off.
Ash, can you speak for a little bit? Seems like your sound is not working for a little bit. Okay. Sorry, Ash, then we might need to talk for Alain for a little bit. Or do you hear him, Alain? Or no?
All right. No, it's, I mean, what Ash was saying was the idea that brands are timeless. It's because that core point. And I like what he was suggesting, that some brands have found some new relevance today. And he didn't say it, but he was implying Zoom as a great example of that. As a brand that has suddenly become more and more relevant, but is it a brand? Or is it just a functional service? Which I think is a key point. Sherry, who I work with, who runs the Amsterdam office, she talks about how tech brands sometimes inform versus persuade. And brands persuade, wherein tech companies tend to inform and really educate you on their product features and why they're special. And I think what Ash was getting at was, and now that you're here, Ash, you can explain. I was talking about how Zoom,
Yep.
Zoom might not be a brand. It's very relevant right now,
Yeah.
and we all understand its product features, but do we understand its emotional reason for being?
Exactly right. And that was my point, that my amazing point that shut off the audio, that there's brands that have been thrusted into the limelight because their products are insanely more useful than they were before this. And I think those are the brands that need to think about what their long-term strategies now, because they're way more relevant. But if you're relevant before this, I don't think you should suddenly overthink what your brand should stand for.
And so far we've been talking about big tech companies, huge brands, but what can smaller companies that maybe don't have that kind of marketing teams do in these times? Ash.
I mean, I think I think there's some really great examples of small business, and you know, small business is a huge range of businesses that have done really well here. I think how do you you know, think about your audience? How do you be very targeted in you know, making them aware of your product? I have been definitely inundated with different types of home gyms and home gym apparatuses over the last you know, 5 to 6 weeks, and you know, I have been looking for weights because you can't go to the gym anymore. And I think they're all small, you know, medium businesses that I've not heard of before, but I think, you know, they're using the right channels. They're using things like Facebook and Instagram, where you can get very targeted and still present your brand in the right way, albeit to a smaller segment or a smaller audience, depending on the scale of your business. But I think at least in New York, there's a ton of really great examples like that.
Mm-hmm. Alain, I think you also wanted to chime in.
No, I think, I mean, Ash hit it on the head. I think that the crisis favors big brands. It favors scale. You know, we know a pet company here, a pet supply company here, that has had a better, every day has been better than Black Friday, which is sort of a big consumer day here in the States. Every day in April was better than Black Friday, which is kind of unbelievable, the big pet supply company. But at the same time, the pet supply company in my building hasn't been able to open yet. So they can't even consider the question you're asking. They're not even thinking about their brand. But what you have, these big other suppliers that are, you know, tearing away and doing extremely well. So I think it's just an unfair question, and it's a limitation of scale.
So it's actually that the gap is only widening because of
Yep.
what's going on right now. Yeah. Okay. How to change the marketing guidebook, playbook, book of rules to try to better cope with, let's say, there will be another wave next year. There will be another pandemic in 5 years. How can we make sure that the next time this happens to us, we are better equipped to handle it?
Let's hope, first of all, there's no more pandemics like this, and it's to come, first and foremost. But I think,
Let's hope so.
yeah, I think, you know, there's a certain sort of stages of the marketing ecosystem or industry that I've seen happen in real time over the last few months, right? I think there was this sort of initial period of a lot of brands felt the need to create some sort of manifesto or like community call to action. And in many cases, that was authentic to who they were. In some cases, that was odd. And then people, I think now the industry is shifting towards really thinking about, okay, where's like the genuine value of my product, and how do I deliver that to our users and our audience, and how do I grow my business through this? I hope that that the initial wave of perhaps like insanity amongst marketers won't exist now that we've done this once, and we can sort of value our users' time and value their attention they're giving us by giving them things that are relevant and useful for them.
Got it. Okay, so we're moving on to the Q&A section. So we have some questions from the audience. First one for Alain. By refusing to revisit the brand archetype, aren't brands running the risks of being irrelevant?
I would say no. I mean, brands are timeless. Real brands. You build brands to last forever. And yes, you can pivot and change here and there, but the best brands, the ones that we talk about, are the ones that haven't changed. Think about Coca-Cola. You know, Coca-Cola stands for nostalgia, comfort, community, Americana, and that's true around the world, right? That has never changed. Now, what has changed are attitudes about carbonated soft drinks and the economy and so on, and health attitudes, but the brand has never changed, and they still talk about joy. They still talk about coming together, and that archetype is timeless. You know, what I will tell you is the mindset of the archetype can shift a little bit. So, you know, the everyman is an archetype, the approachable everyman, like Budweiser is an everyman brand. So instead, what does an everyman brand do at a moment of crisis? They bring people together. You know, they can unite. So maybe that everyman becomes a little bit more of a host in that moment, but the everyman archetype still remains true. And I think that's important. Brands that are fleeting and changing are the ones that consumers don't buy into and don't believe in.
Clear. Second question. Why does every COVID-19 commercial sound the same? What does it show in terms of the consumer and the brand? Maybe a second.
At times like this,
Sorry. Alain.
Unprecedented times like this. No, I'm not going to answer. Ash, you answer, but you know, they all start with like, at times like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great video on YouTube that someone made, a YouTube creator made around all COVID ads are the same, and he did it really well. I think this comes back to my point on just like being really in touch with the landscape and the culture, and where does your brand and product really fit in? And I think there was that initial wave from a lot of brands, like we need to make some sort of manifestoic, sort of longer form call to action to the community. And I think people have graduated beyond that now as this is set in and people understand more. So I think that'll change, but I think there was definitely a lot of, I think brand marketers potentially were sort of getting caught up in the moment and thinking that their brand had to do something, as opposed to thinking about the value of their product and their brand. And that's what you've seen. So I don't disagree with the statement. There was a period of time where every brand felt the same, like piano playing and you know, some sort of you know, the 1 minute ad and with the voiceover.
Definitely. Okay, next question for Alain. How do you think the COVID-19 crisis has influenced the brand loyalty?
No, it's a great question. I think it's polarized brand loyalty, meaning consumers are either more loyal now or much less loyal. These are, I know many people in my own immediate circle, for example, who have made decisions like that are going to stick with them for a long time based on how brands have operated. You know, some have cut cord, some have said, you know, I don't like the way this brand has shown up, or there's been another brand that's been sort of tangential, that's been a little bit more impressive or intriguing, and now is the time to kind of shift loyalty. I think this is a bit of a reset moment when it comes to loyalty, where people will become more loyal to brands or significantly less loyal. You know, Netflix is interesting in this regard because it's sort of solidified itself as in its loyalty, and that it just seems hyper relevant, and all the offerings just seem to be exactly what I need right now, when other entertainment properties, digital entertainment properties, I think are not achieving that same sense.
Okay. And maybe one more question for Alain, because we talked about tone deafness in tech companies before, but definitely Ash can chime in after. By clustering their users in their own social media culture bubbles, do tech companies create tone deafness?
Totally. Totally. So the inherent nature of communication has this bias towards tone deafness, right? Like it's just inherent. The way information is interpreted and received is so delicate, and there's such a fine line between something being wrong or right. Now imagine you're talking to people that look just like you, and you're in a group of people with the same sort of interests. That marginal difference becomes dangerous, and it becomes harder to notice when something is completely off base or gone too far. Were you going to say something, Ash?
No, I think what you're touching on here is also tone deafness comes when you start to get a little out of touch with reality and sort of lack a little diversity in your thinking, right? So I think what Alain might be touching on is a little bit of that as well, right? I think, you know, in some cases, it's very easy to sit in a global team and think that the country you're in is emblematic of the whole situation through this pandemic. But the reality is, countries are at different points in the curve. Some countries are opening up now. Some countries are just beginning sort of their lockdowns. And if you don't have that sort of diverse set of thinking or that global thinking in your team or your culture, you will make missteps. So just to build on that.
And one more question for Ash. How transparent should companies be? Could it harm those companies if they are too transparent?
I think generally it's good to be transparent, right? I think, you know, in the sense that I equate transparency to being authentic, in the sense that don't try be something you're not in this moment. And I think there's quite a few brands that try to be a bit more than they should be or a bit less than they are. But transparency for me equals authenticity. And I think that's something that all brands should aspire to.
And then maybe a question to build on that for Alain. Is there any brand archetype that would benefit from staying under the radar during a crisis? So kind of.
No, it's a very good question. That is a very good question. You know, I think a lot about that too. Like, is it you know, we're told in brand marketing that, you know, you need to be out there and message. But is this a time for some to say, stay quiet and silent? I think a lot about that question. I don't have a definitive answer on it. I think my mind changes on it every day. But I can tell you, you know, I received a commercial the other day from Sandals. I think that's what it's called. Sandals, like the couples retreat in the Caribbean resort. It's like, come away, you know, and escape on the beach. And it just felt, you know, and Sandals is an escape brand. Escape is an archetype, this idea of an escape. And that felt wrong. And so I often wonder, is escape the right thing people need right now? But then I flip the other side sometimes when I'm when I'm depressed and I think I need some escape. So maybe escape is what the world needs right now. So I don't know the answer to that. I think it truly depends on the case and the moment. Because Anoop, what's interesting is, like, we're 3 months later, there's some things that are appropriate now that wouldn't have been appropriate 3 months ago. And that's going to change in a month from now as things begin to open. And even more complicated by what Esh is talking about, the global nature of things and how we're all opening at different paces. So some messages might work in some markets about life, the new normal, versus others. So I think it's a case-by-case scenario.
Yeah, and constantly sort of walking that line and trying to find a balance and finding the right timing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think this was super insightful. Thank you so much for all your input and answers, and thanks for the questions that we got from the audience. And I think it's about time that we have to go back to the studio with Georgina and Boris. So thank you guys so much for being here today.
Yeah,